Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Teach Your Guitar to Sing. And as we do each week, our conversation is about what are the things you can do on guitar to make what you are playing in your everyday guitar playing more interesting, more musical, more emotional in a sense of having emotional highs and lows and being an emotional support for whatever the song that you're singing is and the moods that's being evoked by the words and the melody. How do you make your guitar a full team player in the arrangements that you're making instead of just being a bunch of chords in the background and a bunch of strumming in the background? And that's the kind of conversation we've had each week. And what I would like to do this week is I have a copy of the Teach Your Guitar to Sing palette using a sort of a painting with different colors metaphor for a whole series of different elements that you can vary in the course of playing your way through the chords to a song, and any several of which you put in combination give you variation and different textures and different intensities to use throughout the song. And with the whole array of the palette available to you, it doesn't mean that you have to do every one of those. What is that, about 16 different things? In any song or in any verse of any song. But we've talked about you wanting to construct a kind of an emotional map for the song where do you want it to be strong and intense? Where do you want it to kind of back off? Where do you want it to be a little quiet and let the voice really stand on its own? Where do you want the guitar to really drive the emotion and drive the energy of the song? And when you sort of think about a song from that perspective, almost like it's a theatrical performance, each song having its own arc of beginning and middle and end and highs and lows along the way. That keeps the music interesting for you to play. That keeps the song captivating for whoever's listening to it. And I always say that you are your own most important audience, because if you are not moved and excited by what you're playing, I don't know why in the world you would think that your audience would be moved and captivated by what you're playing. And you're a tough audience because you've played it a lot of times and you know where it's going next. And so you have to do the work to come up with a decent emotional program for a song. And then you have to do the work to be in the song and deliver that emotionality when you perform the song. And again, perform could be in front of a large paid audience, or it could be sit in a circle with a few friends, or it could just be yourself at midnight, playing a song that's a real favorite of yours and wanting to, like really deeply step into that song and experience what the song is about. So that's the idea of Teach Your Guitar to Sing. And again, with each of these elements that we work with, they're not extraordinarily difficult. It's not like learning a long, involved technical solo, or learning to play blues leads for the first time or something like that. These are each individual things that it's the way that they move from one to the other that allows the mood to change and the emotionality to change. And it's also not that any one element is a certain emotion or evokes a certain thing. It's the relationship between things that often is the thing that carries emotion. So with that said, I'm gonna start over on the kind of the bottom side of the palette here. I can't reach in front of that because it's a graphic on the screen. But the greens and blues here, because we've done excuse me, we've done a lot of work with rhythms and the rhythmic palette and the tonal section of the palette. And I want to go over today some things with the chordal and the melodic half of the palette, because we haven't spent as much time on that. Now, we've touched on a lot of things from this side also in the course of working on different songs, but also today, instead of working on a specific song, we're going to work with a couple chord patterns, because I think one of the best things that you can do to work on your expressivity in your guitar playing is to take a couple chords that play in a cycle and play them over and over, and then explore all the things you can do to make them different as you go through. In other words, how long can you keep G, C, D, G, C, D? How long can you keep that interesting? How can you bring it way up? Can you make it really intense and powerful? Can you carefully bring it back down to a middle, and then can you let it down to a real quiet thing? So we'll be doing some different chord patterns with that in mind. And that's that little riffs that I was playing as the opener. That was just taking those chords and working a number of things through it. And we'll cover some of those things in the course of the lesson now. So if you don't have any questions, I will begin. And you can always type questions into the chat if you have the chat available to you. And the first thing we're going to look at on the chordal palette, if you look at the over on the far right side where it's green and it says chord forms. Chord forms simply means for each chord, there are usually several different ways you can finger that chord. Now I'm just going to start with C, one of the early chords people learn. So there's kind of the basic C that everybody learns first. And I'm artificially positioning my hand so that you can kind of see where my fingers are. When I actually play it, it looks a little more like this, but it's hard to tell whether this pinky is on a string or not. And that's the first variation you can do in the C, is add the pinky at 3rd fret on the 1st string. So there's a difference in sound between and it's not that one is better than the other. It's that being able to move from one to the other gives you options. There's a 2-note solo played through a chord just by changing the chord form. So C with the added G. There's also full C where you move the 3rd finger over and tuck the pinky in behind over at the 3rd fret on the 6th string and 5th string. So that gives you a G, which is the 5th note of the C chord in the bass, which is kind of a stronger sound than the E in the bass. The E being the 3rd of the chord. The chord feels a little like toppling over when you have the 3rd on the bottom. It doesn't mean you should never have the 3rd on the bottom by any means, but it's a long musical distance from that low 3rd all the way up to this C. So there's a large gap in the note to note to note relationship of the chord. It's a little smoother sound with the full C. So you've got C, C with G, full C, and then you've got a bar C at the 7th fret, 8th fret, sorry. Then there's some people do this chord, some people don't. There's this bar that's like an A chord, bar at the 3rd fret, and these 2 fingers, and then you flop over to kind of include. That's never been a chord I've been particularly comfortable with. But people use that a lot. And sometimes they just muffle that 2nd string. And some people are able to really flatten this finger down enough. And I think with practice you could do that. Because that's a very useful form. That it's called an A bar, to bar wherever, and then the other fingers make like what would be an A chord compared to the bar, like you would do an A chord compared to, the nut is compared to 0. So that's an A form. So that's a C that you can use. And then there's a little mini version of that, little 3-string chord, shaped like that. So those are all different C's. Now, I'm not going to go through every chord and look at all the variations, but I'm going to look at a couple and then show you how we can use those variations in a mood-changing kind of way. So G, we've got your basic G, which is either done this way or this way. Same notes either way, just different fingering. And then there's this G, where you use the pinky on the 1st string 3rd fret and then tuck your 2nd finger in at 2nd string 3rd fret, which is a G with a high D. And that corresponds in some ways to this C with the G, because you're moving from the 3rd the E up to a G, and in here with the G, you're moving from the third B up to the fifth, the D. So that's a very useful G, and then there's of course a bar G. And there's also this G that is like an F chord moved up 2 frets that you're only going to play 4 strings of, but it's a different flavor. Now that's in the bar, but the bar lets you play the boomy bottom, whereas here it sort of forces you over up into the higher thing. The same thing is true with that C chord bar. You can just do this like an F way up here at the 8th fret. So that's this G. Now there's another little G that is fingered like a D chord at the 7th fret, and you can play the 4th string open plus those 3 notes. You might recognize that riff. That's facilitated by that. Okay, so there's a number of forms for the G, and then we have, let's say E minor. You've got this E minor, you've got that E minor, you've got a bar like an A minor at the 7th fret, and then you have this fingering, which is less familiar. It's an open, kind of an open string fingering. Your 7th fret on the 5th string, and then your pinky and your 3rd finger are at the 9th fret on strings 4 and 3. So that's just those 3 fingers on. My middle finger's not doing it. This finger's not doing anything. And I'm only fingering 3 strings, but that gives you E's and B's, which is the 1s and the 5s of either an E major or an E minor chord, and that will substitute it where an E minor would be used or where an E major would be used. So E minor, if you can picture that, just even going through. It's almost like you change chords, but it's the same chord all the time. So the value of different chord forms is that when you have a long string of the same chord happening over and over, or a long string of the same couple chords happening over and over, one of the ways you can get variation is simply by using a different form for the chords. And you'll discover in a given song, if you play the chord this way, what does it feel like? If you play it this way, what does it feel like? And I can't emphasize enough that your own exploration of what is the emotional impact of any of these elements is, if there's one thing that all these lessons could teach you that would maybe be the most valuable thing, it would be that pay attention to the sounds that you're making and how those sounds make you feel. And that may take a little training. It's just like, well, it's just an E chord. It doesn't feel like anything, you know. Well, I think if you play from chord to chord and you vary some things, you'll discover that every little thing that you change does change the way what you're doing feels. And the more you sort of literally train yourself to be sensitive to that and to be aware of that, the more capable you'll become as a musician in being able to deliver a nice, varied emotional texture in your performances. And again, whether that's performing for yourself or for 10,000 people. Let's look at, let's see, the D chord is a little more limited. You've got this D, you've got the thumb wrapped over on the 6th string 2nd fret, which adds the 3rd on the bottom that we didn't like in the C. But in this case, that 3rd on the bottom is not musically far away from the next note up, so it blends in a little better. And it keeps that D from being sort of a 5-string emptiness, and sometimes you hit that blank E by mistake, and it's a 5-string emptiness with an out-of-chord note on the bottom. So this lets you get all 6 strings and lets you get into the bass range of the guitar for some of the zone strumming that we do. So that's the D. Now there's another D that is third string and second string are the same places, and your pinky goes up to 5th fret on the 1st string. You change your fingerings to get to that. And then there's a D that's like this little this little what I call baby C. See here at the 3rd fret. Up here becomes a baby D, and you can use the 4th string, and you can also use the 5th string. So there's a couple of Ds. So if you look in chord books and look online for any given chord, you'll find a dozen different ways to finger it, and some will just be 3-string fingerings. And this is before we start to get into the harmonic variations of a chord, where you've got D, you've got D major 7th. Many of the harmonic variations of the more complex chords based on D can be substituted where the D chord is happening in a song. So and that would go to C, C major 7th, F, F major 7th, E minor 7th, and so on. So that's chord forms. Now, zone strumming in chords is, if you recall, zone strumming is, strumming in either the bass notes or the treble notes, and it could be 3 strings, it could be 4 strings, but it's shifting the zone on the strings that you're strumming in, so you're not strumming all 6 all the time, and it could be just 2 strings. So within a chord, you'll create a different melodic effect, certainly a different chord feel. If you strum out little mini sections within the chord. So a great exercise is to take, say, a G chord like I just did. I'm using the G with the D on top here. So it's that 4-finger G chord. Now if you just did single strings, but that's not really strumming, that's more like playing a lead. But if you strum and brush a couple strings starting from 6, and then starting from 5, and starting from 4, and 3, and then from 2, and it doesn't make sense to start from 1. So you've got up to, say, 5 zones that you could play in there as roughly 2-note zones. And it could be 2, it could be 3. You're not trying to be precise. We're talking, do you want a high outside fastball? Do you want a curveball that swings down to the inside of the plate? We're not talking about it's 1 inch above the batter's knee and exactly a ½ inch outside the strike zone. If you can do that in baseball, of course, you'll get fabulous sums of money as a pitcher. I don't think anybody would ever use fabulous sums of money if you could precisely play only 2 strings instead of 3 when you did zone strumming. But the advantages of being able to do zone strumming lets you pull out many sounds from just the same old chord. So that's zone strumming in chords, and that is one of the most powerful tools you have, because you could do the whole first verse of a song, let's say something like... all in the bass for the whole first verse. And and you come to the second verse, you go to the middle. And into the top. And then you alternate. And then you start to mix it up. And now you've got, all of a sudden, what was a flat series of chords becomes a three-dimensional landscape that you can choose how you want to support the words to the song from with that. So that's the advantages of zone strumming and chords. Now, extra notes. We've done a bunch of this as we've gone through various songs. Any chord that you're fingering, and again, we're talking at the simple level. We're not talking about jazz chord combinations that take some practice and discipline and some hand training to be able to capture 6 different notes in the same chord or 5 different notes in the same chord to get some of the jazz chord variations. We're just talking about picking up a finger, putting a finger down with the chord that you already have and you're comfortable with. So like, and we've covered many of these, but I'll just illustrate a couple. C chord, pick up the the second finger from the 4th string. Pick it up and then put it down over on the 3rd string. Tuck your pinky in on the 4th string, just behind your 3rd finger. We've already seen to add the G as part of the chord. Add the D on the 2nd string. Pick up the 1st finger. Pick up the 3rd finger. You could flatten out the 1st finger to get that F note, and now you could play a whole C major scale. While fingering the C chord. Now you might have to make some judicious choices about what you do with the other finger, as you leave one note and go to the other. That works, that works, that works, that works, that works. Now, shall I leave that there while I do the B, or shall I go back to move this finger back to where it would normally be in the C chord? It's up to you. Now, if I've already done this D, do I leave that D when I flatten this finger out to get the F note, or do I go back to the regular C chord plus the F note? And then, so that's the idea of any of those notes is available to you if you fool around with them to make up melodies with and to make up fractions of melody with. And I think of those as like free lead parts. That they're it's not like you had to stop and play. You didn't play a bona fide solo note lead that you'd either worked out or had practiced enough to be able to improvise. You could just they're just kind of like little incidental notes or like little ornamental things that you can hang on the branches of the chord, and that approach is especially useful. This extra note melody bits approach. We're going to talk about mini solos in a little bit along the way here, but you can take 3 of them or 4 of them and make a repeating pattern. If you're you're looking for ideas, if you're writing a song and you need something. Take this is just the main chord plus this and plus this, and put together in a repeating pattern. Or and those are like almost chord changes. You could have gone. It's almost like they're turning making your chord change sort of transparent. So it's almost like a pastel chord change that's not as dramatic. When you change from C to F, it's like this was happening. Oh, and now this is happening. It's a very distinct transition. Whereas if you go, there's like a push in the direction of the F, but it's a subtle lean. It's not a whole full step over to a whole new territory. And this is another good example of how each little element that you change produces some kind of a feeling result when you put it into context of a song. And part of your job is, if you're interested in becoming a more musical, very well-rounded intermediate level guitar player, some would say pushing even into expert, that your job is to explore and be versed at working with the emotional consequences of the things that you can do differently. So you're making conscious choices. And in this case, I don't mean that you necessarily are saying, I'm at bar 12, it's time to add that pinky for the F on the C so that I can get exactly this particular effect. I mean not that granular of a detail, but I mean is that you're familiar with what it feels like when you add that little pinky F into the C, because you've done it before, and that feels like a feeling that would fit nice in this song in this spot. Yeah, or you just tried it out when you were working the song out. So yeah, that really works at a. So becoming sensitive to the emotional impact of the things you can change, and being eager to develop a changing arrangement for a song would be two of the prerequisites to really using this material effectively. Now, hammering on and pulling off. We're down here into that almost turquoisey blue at the very almost bottom center, and right over my pinky here, my index finger right there. Hammer on, pull off. So within any chord, you can hammer on many of the notes. First string to hammer to third fret, you can do it. It's not ideal. Third string, there's more power in the bass that you can usually handle a 3-fret hammer on from open to third fret. You have to be tricky. You have to be careful. There's a tricky thing that happens. For example, with this G fingering, as long as the second fret note on the 5th string is held down by the first finger, this finger probably is not going to bump that string. But as soon as you lift that finger up, now it's going to bump against this finger, because you didn't work out that fingering with that note open. So if you were going to do that fingering, you'd have to stand up much straighter, which makes it actually hard to put that finger back down. So if I'm going to hammer on that 2nd fret note on the G, I'm usually going to pick up this finger also. Or you'll see me push a little this way. And again, that's one of the advantages of the zone strumming, is that if you kind of push over this way for those two fingers to do their thing with the hammer on and not interfering with this finger not interfering with that 5th string, you might lose the squeeze on this finger. But if you're strumming over in the bottom half, it doesn't matter. So, feel free to reduce the number of strings you're playing at any point in order to avoid something you're having difficulty with, unless it's musically really critical that you master that difficulty, in which case you got homework to do. So hammering on, and then the C, or hammering on. You can hammer on over a 2-fret span easily enough. So from first finger on the second string first fret, I'm going to hammer on pinky on 3rd fret on that string while I'm fingering the C chord. Now, if that's in the middle of the chord like that, you don't hear the effect of a hammer-on as profoundly in a chord as you do in the treble as you do in the bass. The second note explodes a little more on the lower strings than it does on the D chord. If I strum the whole chord and hammer on that first string note, you can hear it in there, but if I play that note by itself and hammer it on, it's a stronger hammer on. So, like I say, in the treble, you might want to isolate the strings a little more if you're going to hammer on in the treble notes. You can even hammer on this. A minor, E minor, and any of those extra notes that we talked about could be hammered on. So just between those two things, hammering on and extra notes, you've got almost a whole nother spectrum of variations that you can put into whatever you're playing. We also talk about pulling off. Pulling off in a chord is pretty tricky. Pulling off is when you snap your finger away from a fretted note, or maybe from one fretted to another fretted. So that's a hammer on and a pull off. But to do that in the middle of a chord is a little tricky. I think you get more bang for the buck with the hammer on, but don't rule out the possibility of a pull off in the midst of a chord. Now we're still working in the chordal sense here, even as we bleed over into hammering on and pulling off. But you notice that I've labeled that section of the palette the melodic section, because hammering on and pulling off are ways of dealing with individual notes that stand out enough by themselves that we're hearing them as single note transitions. And it gets blurry when we start adding the extra notes into the chord. That there we're in a sort of semi-chordal, semi-melodic thing. That's certainly got a melodic consequence, but it's in a chord context, and I'm not pulling those notes out deliberately for the melody. I'm really using them more for their texture changes they make in the chords. But when we get over into the melodic palette, now we're talking about dealing with sequences of single notes for the impact that melodies have. Now, what's a melody? It's just one note after another with some kind of a time space in between them, or maybe legato, maybe smoothly connected one to the other over some sort of a time interval. And that's all a melody is. You're hearing notes in sequence in time as opposed to notes all at once. Chord, harmony, all at the same time. Melody, one after the other. So if you take a chord, like let's take the G chord again, and you were to play each note in an arpeggio, there you have a melody and a chord blurred together because you're playing a single note sequence. But they're notes from within a chord, and they each keep ringing. See, if I stop at any point, you're hearing the whole chord happen. So arpeggios are kind of a special case right on the borderline between melody and chord. But anytime you're playing a series of single notes, that's what we're talking about by melody. So the first place that you are likely to wind up using single notes on guitar is going to be in bass lines. And that's for a number of reasons, that it's a little easier to pull out single notes from the bottom while you're doing a chord. And the notes on the bottom tend to articulate a little more distinctly and be heard as single notes even as the rest of the chord is happening. So what I call implied bass is if the chords themselves, if you play just the bottom notes and maybe a zone including the bottom note, if you play just the bottom notes of the chord, you may hear what feels like a bass line happening. So C, E minor, A minor, G. So you can become your own, sort of very basic bass player by how you accentuate the bottom notes of the chords, especially if the chords are changing fast enough. Now, if the chords are not changing very often, then you don't have a lot of implied bass choices available. But you may have rhythmic choices in terms of when you decide to hit that bass. So you can, even with a single bass note available, you can make a bass part. Okay, and going back around to the upper side of the palette, that cutting off or muting that whole section of rhythmic effects in the tonal section there, if you muffle and release the note that you have played as the bass note, that's another way of drawing attention to it. So there we have a combination of effects, cutting off and playing an implied bass note. So there I'm going bump, bump. I can't, with my left hand, cut off the open string. So I have bump, bump, bum, bum. Now you can cut off with this, the heel of your right hand. Now, why would you want to do that? I don't know. It's something that you can do. Gives a staccato feel, but the idea that the moving bass line created by changing chords that's all implied bass, creating the dynamic feel of each of those little riffs that I played there, which is just, G, C, D. Okay, so that's implied bass, and a lot of that rests on your ability to hit the bass zone, to work down in the bottom section of the strings. There are many times when you will want to muffle the bass thing. And, see, I'm going up and down on 3 strings. And And the reason for the muffling is it changes the tone. It actually makes it feel a little more like, oh, is that a bass playing? It's in the wrong octave, but maybe. But you know, we're not saying that you can simulate the effect of a bass. If you have a good bass player, buy them dinner at every opportunity, and if you're a professional, pay them really, really well, because it's one of the most important parts of any musical arrangement is what's happening in the bass. But when you're playing by yourself, you're your own bass player, so make sure you buy yourself dinner once in a while. Okay, so that's implied bass. Now then there's fingered bass. Now you'll notice that I'm fingering a chord even as I play those notes. So I could go so you would start, you know, my go with so you'd bring the chords in behind the vocal, but you can start it with the equivalent of a plucked, you know, bottom guitar lead or a bass line, you know, and ideally you'd have a bass and you'd double those two, you know, or the bass is going in boom, 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 while you do that. But these are the kind of things that you can try to bring some of the elements of a great multi-instrument arrangement into a single instrument arrangement on your guitar. So fingered bass lines, you know, let's see, what, you know, things like that. So you know, so there are times, excuse me, there are times when you distinctly want to finger a sequence of bass notes in a pattern. Depends on the song you're doing and what you're trying to do with the song. So that's fingered bass. Now how are we doing? About 15 minutes before the hour. Next thing we have is chord melody. Now what a chord melody is, and this is my term, when you hear the chords play through, especially the upper notes of the chord often suggest a melody. So what song is that, right? So that's, you know, in that case, the chords probably suggested the melody to, you know, as they wrote the song. And you can accentuate that with how you work your zone strumming. Puff the magic dragon, live by the sea. So you can go. You can kind of push the zone that includes the first string and then sort of stops at the second string to get dragon. Now, you're not trying to play that perfectly, but you can imply it. Now here I'm going to finger some actual honest melody notes while doing the A7th chord instead of but the chords themselves do the bulk of that little melody sequence through there, and there'll be lots of sections of songs where that will be true, where just the pattern of the chords what the upper strings do. What the lower strings do. A little different effect between the upper strings and the bottom strings, and that's something that you can choose to bring out a section of melody. It can be very effective to have your guitar play harmony with yourself or double the line that you're singing if you're performing solo, to have the guitar, be your backup singer. And that's one of the notions that had me choose the title "Teach Your Guitar to Sing" as the umbrella for all these different elements and a way of organizing them in your brain. Now we're mixing metaphors because we're teaching guitar to sing, but we're using a painter's palette as the metaphor. So I could have called it "Teach Your Guitar to Paint," but I'm not so sure if people would have made any intuitive connection with what I was talking about. Teach your guitar to sing, it's at least like, what's that about? That sort of connects a little. But visually, having a kind of a visual reference, if you have all these colors to choose from, I think is a nice way to sort of help keep in your brain the possibilities you have. All right, so we did chord melodies. Now the next element is mini solos. And that's in the same vein as fingered bass lines. So if you're playing a or you're playing you can, quibble over, is that a bass line or is that a melody? In this case, I think that in the original song, it's clearly a melody line. It's an instrumental figure that comes many times through the song. It's not a rhythmically driven bottom part, but who cares? It's either a fingered bass or it's a little mini solo. So there are many times in songs where you can okay, so working little individual single notes, which is an extension of what we talked about with, adding extra notes. I'm spoiled when I have a transparent graphic. I can put my hand in front of it. Over there in the green where it's extra notes, those are the kind of things that you work into mini solos, so that if you're playing a song that has a little feature line in it and you can bring that line out, that's really worthwhile. And with My Girl, that feels like a bass part. You could call it a mini solo. Let's see, rhythmic patterns for the D chord. Up with the middle finger, down with the pinky. Same thing with the A. So little bitty melody fragments that are either part of the text or background are one thing, but when they're in the place of a little solo in the song, like that. So that's mini solos, and they become more song specific. And when if you'll as you work out a song, you'll know whether it has built into it little mini solos, and you're going to try to copy and emulate some of those. If you're doing a faithful interpretation, if you're doing a creative interpretation, you may come up with your own or not do them at all. And then the final, the ultimate development of this is solos with chords, and then beyond that would be full on solos. You know, playing long single note sequences that you've worked out, and we're not delving into solo guitar playing in a lead sense in this series, Teach Your Guitar to Sing. But as we did in some of those playing the scales. That's a sequence of melody. Sorry. That's a sequence of notes through a chord, and that's a solo. That's a melody. Now, what melody do you play? There's a let's say you're in a song and you've come to you've done a verse and a chorus and a verse and a chorus, and it's time for the solo. And this particular song has a distinctive solo, perhaps. So whether you play the original distinctive solo or your own, that's up to you. And if you are the only guitar player, the only musician, instrumentalist there, you have to decide: do I stop and just play single notes, or do I try to work a little solo in with some semblance of chords going on? Now, in blues tunes, they're often spare enough that you can just play single notes and then do some chords and then just play single notes, and that is accepted and it works in that idiom. It doesn't necessarily work to do that with a rock and roll song. It can. It depends, especially if you do little bits of chords. But what we're really talking about in Teach Your Guitar to Sing is solos within chords. So if you've got several notes available on a chord, you can make up a rhythmic solo. And that's kind of like a simplified solo. If you were playing if you're playing a single note solo there, you would probably use more notes and you would change notes more often. But you can do a not a bad job of blocking out the core of a solo with just the notes you have in a chord. Now, if there are some chord changes involved, you can pull lots of little solo melodies out from chord patterns. Now, I've done most of this with, C and G and F and, some E minor, some A minor, some D. Some chords are a little more fertile for pulling melodies out of than others. Like on an A major chord, you're kind of stuck in there. It's not like you can go over here and do much unless you release something. So the A chord is maybe a little less fertile than some of the other chords, but then there's other fingerings, remember, to take us back where we started, which was chord forms. This is an A, this is an A, this is an A. So by changing to one of the different chord forms, you may have different, chords with solo possibilities available to you. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm gonna keep this neck down below my graphic there. I'm just gonna play some stuff. I'm gonna take a couple little different chord sequences and work a bunch of these things into them to kind of play us out here. And I thank you for your attention, and I hope this is valuable and useful to you. This has been a more general elements kind of a lesson rather than taking a particular song and working arrangements for the song. But I think if you go back and look at the videotape of this and work with each of these elements that we've presented in the course of this episode, I think you will have a lot to work on to keep you busy and a lot of rich resources for making your song playing more musical and more interesting. So let's see. Let's do some chords. How about the F major seventh and C major seventh. So there's a whole bunch of stuff with F major seventh, C major seventh, A minor, and E minor. So that's a couple chords, and we kind of open with. when you get to 3 chords, that's when you can really get in a. You can try to push a cycle of chords as far as you can in terms of how interesting can you keep it going. A little kind of a reggae backbeat there. Kind of a country. Little rock here. So there you have just a couple of ideas, ways you can take a small series of chords, work a whole bunch of stuff from the bottom part of this Teach a Guitar to Sing palette into them, and generate a whole lot of interest to carry you through your playing. So thank you for coming by, and everyone be well and stay safe, and play your guitar as often as you have a chance to. Good night.